The moment Isaiah Reed rode into Caldwell, Kansas, on a scorching July afternoon in 1882, Olive Vaughn was standing on the train platform trying very hard not to be noticed, which was something she had become extraordinarily skilled at over the course of her 24 years on this earth. She had been standing there for nearly an hour, flanked on either side by women who were prettier, louder, more carefully dressed, and far more certain of themselves than she had ever managed to be. There were 6 of them altogether, all gathered at the invitation of a man named Gerald Hooper, a cattle rancher who had placed an advertisement in 3 different newspapers seeking a wife to manage his household and bear him children. Olive had answered the advertisement not because she harbored any particular romantic feelings toward a man she had never met, but because the alternative was remaining in Wichita in her sister's spare bedroom, dependent on the charity of a woman whose husband made it quietly clear through small daily humiliations that Olive's presence was a burden they were tolerating rather than welcoming. She had packed everything she owned into a single carpetbag. She had taken the train west. She had tried to make herself presentable with what little she had, which amounted to a brown calico dress that had been washed so many times the pattern had nearly faded to nothing, a pair of boots that pinched her left foot, and her dark hair pinned up in a style she had copied from a fashion plate in a magazine she found left on a train seat. She was not beautiful in the way that turned heads, but she had a quality about her face that those who paid attention sometimes called striking wide gray eyes set beneath strong brows, a mouth that was full and serious, cheekbones that caught the light when she turned a certain way. The trouble was that most people did not pay that kind of attention. Most people looked at the women on either side of her first, and Olive had learned not to expect otherwise. Margaret Hale was to her left, and Margaret was everything. She was golden-haired and pink-cheeked, with a laugh that carried across open distances and a figure that made men forget what they had been saying mid-sentence. To Olive's right stood Clara Finch, a widow of 30 who wore black well and whose grief had given her a kind of luminous, tragic beauty that men found irresistible. The other 4 women were similarly arrayed, each one presenting something vivid and immediately apparent that Olive felt she lacked. She stood among them like a brown sparrow among birds of more colorful plumage, and told herself it did not matter, that she was here for practical reasons, that love was not something she had been promised by this arrangement or by life in general. Gerald Hooper had sent word that he would arrive to collect his intended bride by noon. It was now past 2 in the afternoon, and the sun was pressing down on the wooden platform with a kind of relentless heat that made the air shimmer in the distance and turned the unpaved main street of Caldwell into a ribbon of dust and misery. The women had been refreshing themselves from a shared canteen and speaking in increasingly tense voices about what it meant that their prospective suitor was late. Olive said nothing. She stood slightly apart from the others, her carpetbag at her feet, her eyes on the horizon where the prairie stretched out vast and gold and endlessly indifferent. There was something about the plains that she found simultaneously terrifying and beautiful. She had grown up in Missouri, where the land was rolling and wooded and broke the sky into manageable pieces. This Kansas flatness was a different kind of country entirely. It offered no hiding place, no shelter from being seen, and yet paradoxically it made her feel small in a way that was almost like relief. Nobody cared whether you were chosen here. The land itself had no preference. She was thinking this when she heard the horses. There were 2 riders coming up the main street, raising a small curtain of dust behind them, and even from a distance, there was something about the man in front that drew the eye and held it. He rode a dark bay horse with the easy authority of someone who had spent so much time in the saddle that the distinction between himself and the animal had blurred at the edges. He was broad through the shoulders and long in the leg, wearing a dust-colored hat pulled low against the sun, and as he drew closer, Olive could make out the line of his jaw and the set of his mouth and the way he scanned the platform with dark, attentive eyes. The women around her had noticed him too. Margaret straightened her spine and lifted her chin. Clara smoothed her skirt. Murmurs passed between the group like a current through water, and Olive felt the familiar faint contraction in her chest that she had learned to recognize as the prelude to being overlooked. She picked up her carpet bag. She told herself she was simply repositioning for comfort. The bag was heavy and her left foot hurt in the boot, and she shifted her weight to her right side and looked away from the approaching riders toward the far end of the platform, where a young boy was chasing a chicken that had apparently escaped from somewhere. The riders reached the platform, and the second man, shorter, red-faced, wearing an expensive vest that had seen better days, was Gerald Hooper. He dismounted with the effort of a man who had more money than physical grace and straightened his vest and looked at the assembled women with the expression of a man surveying cattle at market. He was already smiling at Margaret. Anyone could see that. The smile was heading for Margaret the way a compass needle heads for north, but the man on the dark bay horse had not dismounted. He had drawn his horse to a stop at the far end of the platform from where Margaret stood, from where most of the women stood, from where any rational man would have stopped if he wanted to be surrounded by the most attractive options available. His horse stood still as though it had been anchored to the earth, and the man on its back was looking down the length of the platform with those dark eyes that were not in any hurry. He looked past Margaret. He looked past Clara. He looked past each woman in turn with a measured, unhurried quality that was not dismissive but simply deliberate, as though he were reading a text rather than making a selection. His eyes found Olive at the far end of the platform, beside the boy and the loose chicken, holding her carpetbag with both hands, looking at nothing in particular, because she had already decided she had not been selected, and was mentally preparing for the conversation she would need to have with Gerald Hooper about whether any of the remaining arrangements still applied to her. The man on the dark bay horse looked at her and stopped looking anywhere else. He swung down from his saddle in one fluid motion and looped his reins around the post nearest to where she stood and took off his hat in a gesture that was somehow both formal and entirely natural. And Olive realized with a start that had nothing to do with elegance and everything to do with genuine surprise that he was walking toward her. He was taller than she had estimated from a distance, and younger, perhaps 28 or 29, with a face that had been weathered by sun and wind into something clean and strong and honest. There was a small scar below his left eye, fine as a thread. His eyes, close up, were a very dark brown, almost black in the shadow of the afternoon, and they were trained on her face with a quality of attention that she was not accustomed to receiving and did not immediately know what to do with. "Are you Olive Vaughn?" he asked. His voice was deep and unhurried, carrying a quality of certainty that was not aggression but simply the sound of a man who said what he meant and meant what he said. She stared at him. Around them, she was dimly aware that Gerald Hooper had reached Margaret, and that the other women were watching this exchange with expressions ranging from confusion to something sharper and less kind. "I am," she said, because it was the truth, and because she could not think of a reason to say otherwise, though part of her brain was racing through the question of how this stranger knew her name. "Isaiah Reed," he said, and offered his hand. "I'm a neighbor of Hooper's. He asked me to ride in with him today, and I've been carrying a letter for you since Tuesday." He reached into his coat pocket and produced an envelope that was somewhat worn at the corners, as though it had traveled some distance. "Your sister in Wichita forwarded it to Hooper's ranch thinking you were already there. It's from your mother." Olive set down her carpetbag and took the letter with hands that were not entirely steady, because she had not heard from her mother in 8 months, and the sight of the familiar handwriting on the front was enough to make something loosen dangerously in her chest. "Thank you," she said. "You're welcome," said Isaiah Reed. He was still looking at her, not at Margaret, who had just laughed at something Gerald Hooper said with the full force of her golden charm. Not at Clara, whose dark beauty was drawing glances from every man within eyeshot. He was looking at Olive Vaughn, who was standing on a train platform in a faded calico dress holding a letter from her mother, and he was looking at her the way a man looks at something he has been searching for without knowing what it was he was searching for. "I hope the news is good," he said, nodding toward the letter. "I hope so too," she said. There was a pause between them that was not uncomfortable. The loose chicken ran between their feet and the boy chased after it calling apologies, and Olive watched it pass, and when she looked back up Isaiah Reed was smiling. A quiet, unforced smile that reached his eyes and changed his whole face, and she felt something shift inside her like a lock turning over. The afternoon did not go the way any of them had planned. Gerald Hooper, it emerged over the next hour, had made his selection of Margaret Hale within approximately 4 minutes of meeting her, and informed the other 5 women with a kind of brisk financial practicality that their arrangements were unfortunately no longer required, though he would of course cover the cost of their return journey. He said this while barely looking at any of them, so absorbed was he in Margaret's answering smile, and the remaining women received this information with varying degrees of stoicism, wounded pride, and one spectacular instance of Clara Finch, telling Gerald Hooper exactly what she thought of men who invited women across the territory on the premise of a marriage proposal, only to behave like buyers at a livestock auction. Olive heard all of this from the far end of the platform where she had sat down on a bench to read her mother's letter. The letter was 3 pages long and written in her mother's careful, looping hand. Her mother was well. She had recovered from the illness that had kept her from writing. She was living now with Olive's aunt in Springfield, which was a better arrangement than the one that had preceded it. She asked after Olive. She said she was sorry for the long silence. She said she thought about Olive every day and that she prayed for her and she loved her, and she was proud of her for striking out to make her own way in the world. Olive read this 3 times. Then she folded the letter with great care and put it in her carpetbag, and sat for a moment with her hands in her lap and her gray eyes very bright and her expression very composed, the way it was when she was feeling more than she knew how to contain. "Bad news." Isaiah Reed had come to stand a few feet away, his hat back on his head, looking at her with that same quality of attention that she kept finding disconcerting. "No," she said. "Good news, actually. My mother is well." She paused. "I hadn't known whether she was for a while." He nodded slowly, as though he understood what it was to carry that kind of uncertainty and then have it lifted. He turned and looked at the scene playing out near the other end of the platform, where Gerald Hooper and Margaret Hale were deep in a conversation that had already taken on the comfortable warmth of a thing decided, and where the other women were organizing themselves around the practicalities of their altered situations. "I take it you'll be needing alternative arrangements," he said, not unkindly. "I will," Olive said, "though I'm not certain what they look like yet." "There's a decent boarding house 2 streets over," he said. "Mrs. Patterson runs it. She's fair and she doesn't ask too many questions. You'd be safe there while you work out what comes next." Olive looked at him. "You know Caldwell well." "Well enough. I've been running cattle through here for 4 years, know most of the people." He paused, turning the brim of his hat in his hands with a kind of restless energy that was the first sign she had seen that he was not as settled in himself as he appeared. "I have a spread about 12 miles southeast of town. Been there 3 years now, building it up. It's not much yet, but it's honest work and it's mine." She did not know why he was telling her this. She stored the information carefully nonetheless. "I appreciate the recommendation about the boarding house," she said. "I can walk you there if you'd like, show you the way." She considered him. In her experience, men did not volunteer to be useful without wanting something in return, and she had grown careful about what she allowed herself to want or expect. But there was nothing in his face that she could identify as calculation. He stood there in the afternoon heat with his hat in his hands and his eyes steady, and his expression open in a way that she found, against her better caution, disarming. "All right," she said, and stood up and picked up her carpetbag. They walked through the main street of Caldwell together, and he carried her bag after offering twice and being refused once and accepted the second time. And she learned as they walked that he was 28 years old, that he had grown up in Texas, that his father had been a cattleman and his father's father before him, that he had come to Kansas because the land was still affordable and the cattle markets were good, and because he had wanted something that was his own rather than inherited. He told her these things in the same unhurried way that he had spoken from the beginning, as though he was not performing or impressing, but simply telling the truth, because it was more efficient than anything else. She told him she was from Missouri. She told him about her sister's house in Wichita. She did not tell him the part about feeling like a burden, but she suspected from the quality of his listening that he heard it anyway. Mrs. Patterson's boarding house was a clean, two-story frame building with a porch hung with drying herbs and a tabby cat asleep on the front step. Mrs. Patterson herself was a compact woman of about 50 with iron-gray hair and the kind of eyes that assessed quickly and accurately. And she looked at Olive for exactly 3 seconds before deciding she was the acceptable sort, and leading her upstairs to a room that was small but clean, with a window that looked out over the side yard where someone had planted a kitchen garden. Isaiah Reed stood in the downstairs hallway holding Olive's carpet bag and looking like a man with somewhere else to be who was finding reasons to stay. "It's a good room," he said when Olive came back down to take her bag. "It is," she agreed. "I'll be in town until Friday," he said. Picking up supplies and attending to some business at the land office, he paused. "If you wanted company for supper tonight, there's a decent place on the next street. The food is real and the portions are honest." She looked at him for a long moment. She thought about what it meant that he had ridden past 5 other women on that platform and brought her a letter, and looked at her with the kind of attention she was not accustomed to, and offered to walk her to a boarding house, and was now standing in Mrs. Patterson's hallway offering supper. She thought about whether she was reading all of it correctly, or whether she was so unused to being chosen for anything that she was constructing meaning out of simple courtesy. "I would like that," she said. "Thank you." The smile came back, that quiet one that changed his whole face, and he put his hat back on and said he would call for her at 6, and then he went out through Mrs. Patterson's front door, and Olive stood in the hallway listening to his boots on the porch steps, and felt something she had not felt in a very long time, which was the tentative, dangerous, inconvenient thing that was hope. Supper at the restaurant on Chestnut Street was a plate of beef stew and cornbread and 2 cups of strong coffee each, eaten at a table near the window, while the evening light turned the dust on the main street to copper. They talked for 2 hours. Olive had not talked to anyone, not really talked, the kind of talking where both parties are genuinely interested in what the other is saying, in longer than she could accurately remember, and the experience was so unfamiliar that it took her the better part of an hour to stop measuring her words carefully before she spoke them, and simply say what was on her mind. She told him about Missouri. She told him about the farm she had grown up on, and the way it had gone under when she was 16 after 3 bad harvests and her father's death, and the way everything had shifted after that, the family scattered like seeds on hard ground. She told him she had worked as a seamstress in Wichita for 2 years before the business she worked for closed, and that she was a good seamstress, actually, and that was not vanity but simply a skill she had and was not ashamed of. He listened to all of it without interrupting, his coffee cup in his hands, his dark eyes attentive. When she finished, he asked questions that demonstrated he had actually heard what she said, not just waited for his turn to speak, and she found this so unusual that she almost remarked on it. He told her about his ranch. 12 miles southeast, 400 acres of mixed grassland, a house he had built himself with 2 other men over the course of a summer, a herd of about 200 cattle that he was slowly building toward the number that would make the operation genuinely profitable. He had a man who worked with him, a Tejano named Rodrigo Vasquez who had been with him since Texas, and the two of them ran the operation through the hard seasons and the good ones with equal persistence. "Is it lonely?" Olive asked before she could think whether it was too personal a question. He did not seem to find it too personal. He considered it seriously for a moment, turning his coffee cup in his hands. "Sometimes," he said. "The land is good company, but land doesn't answer back." She understood this better than she could have said. They walked back to Mrs. Patterson's in the blue evening, the street quieter now, a few lights burning in windows along the way. There was a warm wind coming off the prairie that carried the smell of grass and dry earth, and something flowering that she could not identify. She had been in Caldwell for less than 8 hours, and she was already beginning to feel the particular quality of the place. Its raw, uncompleted edges, the sense of a thing still being constructed, lives and fortunes still being decided rather than settled. He stopped at Mrs. Patterson's gate and handed her the latch in a way that was both courteous and natural, and for a moment they were close enough that she could see the scar below his eye clearly and the particular darkness of his eyes in the failing light. "I'll be at the land office tomorrow morning," he said, "in case you needed to know where I was." "In case I needed to know," she repeated, and something in her voice was a little less careful than it had been all evening. "I'll be at the general store in the afternoon," he added, "and here again at 6 if you'd be willing." She looked at him steadily. "I'm willing," she said. He nodded once, the hat brim dipping slightly. "Good night, Miss Vaughn." "Good night, Mr. Reed." She went inside. She climbed the stairs to her small, clean room. She sat on the edge of the narrow bed and looked out the window at the dark garden below, and felt the strange, lit feeling in her chest that she had not had cause to feel in so long that it took her several minutes to identify it. She was 24 years old, and she had spent most of her life being the woman that people looked past on the way to someone more immediately appealing, and she had constructed an identity around not needing to be chosen, not expecting to be first, finding ways to be sufficient unto herself. She had built herself a kind of dignity out of invisibility, which was the best material available when no other was offered. And then a man on a dark bay horse had ridden down a train platform and looked past every woman standing between them and stopped at her. And she did not know what to do with that, yet except sit with it in the quiet of the evening and let it be true. The next 3 days had a quality to them that Olive would later think of as suspended, like a note held past its expected resolution. Isaiah came at 6 each evening as promised, and each evening they ate together and talked, and she learned him in the slow, careful way that she did most things, not rushing to conclusions but attending to the accumulated evidence. She learned that he was thoughtful in a way that some men expressed as slowness but was in fact precision. He did not say things he did not mean, and he did not mean things carelessly. She learned that he had a sense of humor that emerged obliquely, a dry observation delivered in his steady voice that took a moment to register, and then hit with unexpected force. She learned that he had strong opinions about land management and cattle grazing and the ethics of the growing cattle trade, and that he held these opinions with the same unflappable certainty with which he seemed to hold everything. She learned about his views on the state of the territory. He was not a man who ignored what was happening around him. He spoke with careful honesty about the way the cattle industry was reshaping the plains, displacing the people who had lived there long before any of the ranchers arrived, Comanche and Cheyenne and Arapaho peoples who were being pushed further and further onto reservation land as the demand for beef and the push of settlers moved relentlessly westward. He did not speak of it with guilt exactly, but with a kind of clear-eyed acknowledgement that the life he was building was entangled with a history that was not simple or clean. She respected him more for this than for almost anything else. She also explored Caldwell during the days, which was a busier and more complicated place than she had initially registered. It sat at the edge of the Kisham Trail, which meant that for several months of the year it was a transit point for enormous cattle drives moving north from Texas, which meant a particular kind of population, and a particular kind of energy drovers and cowboys spending their wages after months on the trail, merchants who had followed the money north, saloons that operated around the clock during the season. It was not a gentle town, but it was alive in a way that Wichita, despite being larger, had not felt to her, and she found herself walking its unpaved streets with the tentative beginning of attachment. She also, on the second day, found the work. There was a woman named Sylvia Crane who ran a small dressmaking and alteration shop on the east side of Chestnut Street, and she had a sign in her window that said she was looking for assistance. Olive went in with her sample work, 3 items she carried always in her bag: a carefully made shirt collar and a pair of hemmed trousers, and a small piece of decorative needlework. And Sylvia Crane examined them with the professional eye of a woman who knew good work when she saw it, and said she could offer steady hours and fair wages starting Monday if Olive was interested. Olive was interested. She told Isaiah about it at supper that evening, and the pleasure on his face was unguarded and immediate. "That's good news," he said. "That's very good news." "I thought so," she said, and found she was smiling at her plate. "You'll stay in Caldwell then," he said. It was not quite a question, but it had the shape of one. "For now," she said. "I have a room and soon I'll have wages. That's more than I had a week ago." "It is," he agreed. He was quiet for a moment. "I'm glad," he said then simply, and she understood that he meant something more specific than the general satisfaction of hearing that a person's prospects were improving, and she felt the warmth move through her chest again, that inconvenient, necessary warmth. On Friday morning, he came to find her at Sylvia Crane's shop, where she had gone to discuss the particulars of Monday's start, and to examine the inventory of materials and understand the scope of what the work would involve. He stood at the shop door and took off his hat and asked if she would walk with him before he left for the ranch. They walked to the edge of town, where the prairie began in earnest, the grass stretching south in the hot morning light, and they stood at the boundary between the built place and the open land, and she could see 12 miles southeast, and understood for the first time that his ranch was out there somewhere in that enormous unbroken distance. "I want to come back into town next week," he said. "That's your prerogative," she said. "I want to come back specifically to see you," he said, with that precision that was one of the things she was already most certain about in him. She looked at him for a long time. The wind was moving through the grass with a sound like breathing. A pair of red-tailed hawks turned slow circles high above them in the blue dome of the sky. "I'd like that," she said. Something in him settled visibly, as though he had been holding tension she had not been able to detect and had now released it. He put his hat back on and turned to look out at the prairie himself, and then turned back to her with that quiet smile. "I should tell you something," he said. "I'm not a man who comes to things sideways. I don't have much practice with it, and I don't think I'm suited to it." He paused. "I noticed you on that platform before I ever got close enough to know your name. I don't know how to explain that except to say it's true. And I've spent 3 evenings talking to you, and I want to spend considerably more than 3 evenings talking to you." She held very still. She did not trust herself to speak immediately because the thing happening in her chest was large and precarious, and she needed a moment to be sure her voice would be level. "I want that too," she said. He held out his hand and she gave him hers, and he held it for a moment. Just held it, his large warm hand enclosing hers, and then he released it and touched the brim of his hat and turned and walked back toward town to collect his horse and his supplies for the long ride home. And she stood at the edge of the prairie and watched him go and felt the particular terror and wonder of the thing that was clearly, undeniably, unavoidably beginning. The weeks that followed were made of letters and Sundays. Isaiah rode the 12 miles into Caldwell every Sunday without fail, and on the Sundays when weather or cattle work prevented riding, which happened twice in the first 2 months, he sent letters by way of the man who ran supplies between the outlying ranches and the town. His letters were like his speech, direct, specific, honest, and Olive read each one so many times that she knew them by memory before the next one arrived. She wrote back every Sunday evening in Mrs. Patterson's sitting room, and she poured into those letters a quality of honesty that she had never found easy to achieve in spoken conversation, the written word offering her the slight remove that allowed her to say what she actually thought and felt rather than the carefully managed version she usually offered. She was making progress at Sylvia Crane's shop. Sylvia was a brisk, capable woman in her early 40s, a widow who had built the business herself and ran it with the focused efficiency of someone who could not afford to be anything other than capable. She treated Olive as a professional from the first day, assigning her work that matched her skills, paying her on time, making no comment on Olive's personal affairs except to note once, with a slight smile, that Isaiah Reed had a solid reputation in the county and that solid reputations were worth something. Olive's reputation in Caldwell was building in its own right. She was good at her work and she was honest and she was reliable, and in a town where those qualities were not universal, they were noticed. Mrs. Patterson stopped charging her for the smaller courtesies of the house, the evening tea, the use of the sitting room because, she said, Olive was good for the tone of the place. Margaret Hale's wedding to Gerald Hooper took place in late August, a lavish affair by Caldwell standards, and Olive made the alterations to Margaret's dress, and did it so well that 3 other women asked for her card the following week. Clara Finch had stayed in Caldwell too, having found work as a bookkeeper for one of the merchants, and she and Olive had reached a quiet, respectful friendship built on the shared recognition that they were both women making their own way in a place that was designed primarily for men's purposes, and that this required a certain quality of backbone that they both possessed. By September, the air had the first edge of autumn in it, and the cattle season was winding toward its close, which meant the trail drivers were finishing their last runs north, and the town was quieting toward its winter shape. Isaiah came on Sundays, and they walked and talked and ate at the restaurant on Chestnut Street, and sometimes sat on Mrs. Patterson's porch in the cooling evenings, while the sky went through its extraordinary transitions from blue to gold to deep violet. One Sunday evening in late September, she was sitting on the porch with her hands wrapped around a cup of tea, and he was beside her in one of the cane chairs that Mrs. Patterson kept there, and they had been talking about the coming winter and what it demanded of a ranch operation, and then they had lapsed into a comfortable silence that she recognized as the particular kind that only existed between people who were genuinely at ease with each other, and she was looking at the first stars appearing in the darkening sky when he said, "I want to show you the ranch." She looked at him. "If you were willing to ride out next Sunday," he said. "Rodrigo and his wife Alina would be there for propriety, but I want you to see it. I want you to see what I've built and what I'm building." She understood what he was saying. He was asking her to see the life he was offering, not abstractly but concretely in its actual dimensions. He was saying, "Here is the thing, come and look at it and decide if it could be yours." "I'd like that very much," she said. The ride out to the Reed Ranch took 2 hours on the horse he had borrowed from a neighbor for her use, a steady bay mare named Penny who navigated the flat prairie roads with bovine composure. The morning was clear and sharp, with the particular autumn light that turned everything gold and elongated shadows across the grass. Isaiah rode beside her and pointed out the landmarks he had learned, a particular rock formation that marked the halfway point, a dry creek bed that ran full in spring, the distant tree line that indicated the approach of his property. The ranch house came into view gradually as they crested a low rise, and she drew her horse to a stop without thinking and just looked at it for a moment. It was not grand. It was a 2-room frame house with a covered porch on the south face and a stone chimney at one end, surrounded by the working infrastructure of a cattle operation. A barn, 2 outbuildings, a corral where several horses moved in the morning light. But it had been built with care. She could see that even from a distance. The lines were straight and the materials were sound, and the whole thing had the quality of something made to last, not just to serve an immediate purpose. "You built this," she said. "Rodrigo and I," he said, "and a man named Cole who has since moved on, took most of a summer." She looked at it for another long moment and felt something settle in her, slow and certain and important. They spent the day there. Rodrigo Vasquez was a compact, weathered man of about 40, with a dry wit and an evident affection for Isaiah that spoke to years of shared work and shared difficulty. Elena Vasquez was warm and forthright, a woman of perhaps 35 who had been in Kansas 4 years and who looked at Olive with openly friendly assessment, and within an hour had decided they were going to be friends, an intention she communicated not through any formal statement but simply by behaving as though it were already true. They ate midday dinner at the table in the main room, a good beef stew that Alina had made, with cornbread and dried apple pie afterward, and Isaiah showed her the property in the afternoon, the cattle grazing in the south pasture, the garden Alina had planted against the east wall of the house, the beginnings of an extension he was planning to build on the west side of the house that would add 2 more rooms. 2 more rooms, she said, when he showed her the marked foundation, stone outlined in the dry grass. A proper kitchen, he said, and a bedroom. He was not looking at her when he said it, but there was a precise quality to his stillness that told her he was attending closely to her response. She looked at the outline in the grass. She thought about being 24 years old and having spent years feeling as though the life she wanted was being distributed to people ahead of her in a line she could not see the front of. She thought about the faded calico dress and the train platform and the carpetbag and her mother's letter. And she thought about 3 evenings in Wichita trying to shrink herself small enough to go unremarked. And she thought about a man on a dark horse who had ridden past every other option and stopped at her. "Isaiah," she said. He turned and looked at her. "Are you asking me something?" she said. "Because I think you might be, but I want to be sure, because I've found that I do better when things are said plainly." He held her gaze for a long moment, and then something in his face opened up in a way she had not seen before, not the quiet smile she was used to, but something fuller and less guarded, something that looked very much like the expression of a man who had been carrying something carefully for a long time and was deciding to put it down. "I'm asking you to consider marrying me," he said. "Not because it's practical, though it is. Not because you're a capable woman, though you are. I'm asking because every Sunday when I ride back to this place, I spend the whole 12 miles thinking about what you said last and what I want to say next, and that is not a thing that has happened to me before." He paused. "I'm asking because I think this house would be better with you in it, and I think my life would be better with you in it, and because when I was on that platform in July and I saw you standing there at the end of it, I didn't want to walk toward anyone else." The afternoon light was long and golden across the grass, and the horses were moving in the corral, and somewhere in the distance, a meadowlark was singing with extraordinary simplicity, and Olive Vaughn, who had never once been chosen first and had built an entire identity around not needing to be, stood in the marked outline of a future and felt her carefully constructed self-sufficiency dissolve at its edges in the most welcome way she had ever experienced. "Yes," she said, "I will marry you." He crossed the distance between them in 2 steps and took her face in his hands with a gentleness that was completely at odds with his size and strength. And he kissed her once, softly, in the afternoon light, and she put her hands against his chest and felt his heart beating fast under her palms, which meant he was not as steady as he appeared, which meant this mattered to him exactly as much as it mattered to her, and that was everything. They were married in November of 1882 in the small white church on the north end of Caldwell's Main Street, on a cold, clear day when the sky was the particular blue of late autumn, and the prairie was tawny and still. Mrs. Patterson came. Clara Finch stood with Olive as her witness. Rodrigo and Elena Vasquez drove in from the ranch, and Elena brought preserved apricots and a bottle of good brandy for the celebration, and wept openly and unself-consciously during the ceremony in a way that made several other people in the small congregation feel they were entitled to do the same. Olive wore a dress she had made herself, ivory wool with a deep green collar and cuffs, tailored to fit her precisely, not the faded calico, not anything borrowed or second-hand, but something she had made for herself with her own hands and her own craft, and she wore it with a quality of quiet pride that was not vanity but simply the bearing of a woman who had finally put on something that was entirely her own. Isaiah wore his good coat and a clean white shirt, and his boots polished to an unusual degree, and he stood at the front of the small church and watched her come up the aisle, and his expression was the unguarded, fully open one she had first seen at the ranch, and it did not waver for the duration of the ceremony. The minister was a thin, earnest man named Reverend Cole who took the words seriously and spoke them with care, and when he reached the part where he asked if she took this man, Olive said, "I do," in a voice that was clear and steady and without a single reservation, and Isaiah said the same with the same quality, and when he was told he could kiss his bride he did so without a shred of self-consciousness, and with a warmth that made Mrs. Patterson say, "Well," to no one in particular in a tone of great approval. They drove out to the ranch that afternoon through the cold golden light, Olive in the wagon seat beside him with her carpetbag between their feet, and as they came over the low rise that brought the house into view, she felt the same thing she had felt the first time. That recognition, that sense of a life she had not dared to imagine being both real and hers. And she reached over and put her hand in his, and he closed his fingers around it and did not let go for the rest of the drive. The first winter at the ranch was hard in the way that first winters in new places always are, the difficulty not of catastrophe, but of adjustment, of learning the rhythms and requirements of a life different from any she had lived before. She learned where the drafts came in the house and how to bank the fire against the coldest nights, and what the cattle required in the way of supplemental feeding when the grass was frozen, and how to read the sky for the kind of storms that came across the open plains without the obstruction of hills or trees to give warning. Elena Vasquez was 12 miles in the other direction along the ranch road, and in good weather that was not far, and they established a pattern of visiting twice weekly that was both practical and sustaining. They shared supplies and information, and the particular kind of conversation that was only possible between women who were in similar circumstances, and willing to speak honestly about what those circumstances demanded. Olive still worked for Sylvia Crane, riding into Caldwell twice a week for the hours she had committed to, and this arrangement satisfied several needs at once. The additional income was useful as the ranch was still in its building years. The work itself was a source of satisfaction and identity, and the regular time in town kept her connected to a world beyond the ranch that she was not ready to entirely leave behind. Isaiah said once that he admired her for keeping the work, that it would have been easy to stop, and he was glad she had not. She appreciated this more than she said, because the admiration was genuine, and because she had been braced, if not quite expecting, a different response. She had known women whose husbands had considered their wives' work outside the home a comment on the men's provision, and Isaiah was so entirely free of this that she marked it as one of his fundamental qualities, the kind that told you everything essential about a person's character. They were building the extension in the spring. Isaiah and Rodrigo framed it up in March and April when the ground thawed, and by May the new kitchen stood complete on the west side of the house, stone-floored and light from 2 south-facing windows and smelling of fresh lumber, and the whitewash they had applied to the interior walls. Olive stood in it on the day it was finished and turned around slowly, and thought about the foundation outline in the grass that Isaiah had shown her on that October afternoon, and felt the deep satisfaction of a person who had watched something promised become something real. She planted a kitchen garden against the south wall of the new addition in April, following Elena's example and Elena's advice about what grew well in this latitude and this soil. By June she had parsley and thyme and sage, and a sprawl of kitchen tomatoes, and a row of onions that were coming in well, and she found that she tended the garden with a quality of pleasure that surprised her. She had not known before this that she would enjoy growing things, but there was something in the specific satisfaction of it, the evidence of care made visible in green and growing things that suited some aspect of her nature that had not previously found an outlet. The summer of 1883 was long and hot, which was good for the cattle operation and challenging for most other things. The Kishom Trail was as busy as ever, and Caldwell was in full summer chaos when she rode in for her days at Sylvia Crane's shop, loud and populated and alive with the specific energy of a trail town at the height of its season. There were sometimes altercations and occasional gunfire in the night, though the town marshal kept things from getting entirely out of hand, and Olive navigated it with the equanimity of someone who had learned the place well enough to know its rhythms and its dangers. It was in August of that summer that Clara Finch, who had been keeping her own counsel about her private life since their friendship began, confided over tea at Olive's kitchen table that she had been seeing someone. A man named David Archer who ran the hardware supply operation on the north end of town. A quiet, serious man of about 35 who wore spectacles and had opinions about supply chain logistics that Clara found, to her own slight surprise, genuinely interesting. Olive listened to Clara describe this man with careful, qualified hope, the vocabulary of a woman who had been disappointed before and was not ready to trust her own feelings entirely, and she thought about how she had once sounded exactly like that, and she said, "It sounds to me like you like him very much." Clara said she supposed she did. Olive said that was worth paying attention to. Clara got married the following spring and Olive made her dress. By the autumn of 1883, it was apparent to Olive that she was expecting their first child, a realization she arrived at by a combination of evidence and the specific quality of certainty that is difficult to explain to someone who has not experienced it. She told Isaiah on a Sunday evening in October when they were sitting on the porch watching the last light leave the sky, and he was silent for a moment so long that she turned to look at him. His face was doing something that she had not seen it do before, which was expressing multiple things simultaneously, wonder and fear, an enormous, specific tenderness. And she understood that he was feeling the weight of this news as precisely as she was, which was the only response she had wanted. He put his arm around her and she leaned into him, and they sat there in the cooling evening with the prairie dark around them and the stars beginning to appear in numbers that never stopped being extraordinary to her. And the first thing he said was, "Are you all right?" "I'm perfectly all right," she said. "Good," he said. He held her more tightly. "Good," he said again, with a different weight on the word, and she understood that the second time it was not a response to her answer but an expression of something larger. She continued to work at Sylvia's shop through the winter, reducing her hours as her body made different demands, and Sylvia was practical and unsentimental about this in a way that meant there was no awkwardness about it, only sensible adjustment. Isaiah was watchful in a way that was attentive rather than restrictive. He said once that she was the one with the better judgment about what she was and was not capable of, and he meant it, and she took him at his word. Their son was born in May of 1884 on an evening when the spring storms were moving through the territory in the way they did on the open plains, spectacular and serious. And Alina Vasquez had been there for 2 days in anticipation, because the doctor was in Caldwell, and 12 miles was too far for certainty. The boy arrived into Alina's capable hands and Olive's own remarkable composure, with a cry that filled the room entirely and a head of dark hair, and a face of extraordinary and immediately obvious personhood. And Isaiah stood at the side of the bed holding Olive's hand, and looking at his son with an expression of complete and irreversible dissolution that she would keep in her memory for the rest of her life. They named him Daniel Thomas Reed, Daniel for Isaiah's father and Thomas for Olive's. He was a solid baby, and then a determined toddler, and then a child of unnerving intelligence who asked questions that required genuine thought to answer, and had his father's steady dark eyes and his mother's gray assessment, and some quality of his own that was entirely Daniel. The ranch was growing. The herd had reached 400 head by 1885, and the operation was generating returns that allowed for genuine reinvestment rather than merely survival. Isaiah hired 2 additional hands, men recommended by Rodrigo who knew the work and were solid. A young man named Thomas Cross, who was about 20 and learning the business from the ground up, and an older hand named Pete Mallory, who had been running cattle for 30 years and whose knowledge of the practical management of a working ranch was encyclopedic and invaluable. The house grew too. Isaiah and Rodrigo added a bedroom for Daniel in the summer of 1885, and Isaiah framed in a small study on the east side of the house at Olive's request, a room with a good south window and space for a writing table, because she had told him once that she had always wanted a room of her own for reading and thinking, and he had not forgotten. She loved the study with a completeness that was slightly embarrassing in its intensity. She had accumulated a small collection of books over the 3 years she had been in Caldwell, and at the ranch novels and practical references, and a very good natural history of the Kansas plains that she had read twice, and she arranged them on the shelves Isaiah built into the east wall. And on winter evenings, she sat at her writing table with the lamp lit and the wind against the windows and read or wrote letters, with the specific quality of contentment that came from being exactly where she wanted to be. In the evenings, when Daniel was in bed and the house was settled, she and Isaiah sat by the fire in the main room or on the porch in summer, and they still talked the way they had on those first evenings at the restaurant on Chestnut Street, with the same quality of genuine mutual interest and the additional depth that 3 years of shared experience provided. He told her about problems on the ranch, and she thought through them with him. She told him about things she had read and ideas she had encountered, and he engaged with them seriously, offering his own thinking, disagreeing when he disagreed with the same directness he brought to everything. She did not stop being surprised by how good it was. She had been prepared for the adjustment of marriage to involve sacrifice and accommodation and the careful management of competing needs, and it did involve all of those things, but not in the manner she had braced for. It involved them because any life of genuine consequence involves accommodation and management, not because either of them was requiring the other to be less. In the fall of 1885, there was a period of several weeks that tested the ranch more seriously than anything previously had. A series of early storms came through in October with unusual severity, and the combination of early hard freezes and heavy early snowfall meant that the cattle needed to be brought in, and the supplemental feed situation became urgent. 2 of the horses came up lame within days of each other, which complicated every aspect of the operation. One of the outbuildings lost a section of its roof to wind damage, and the repair had to be done quickly to protect the equipment stored inside. Isaiah managed it all with the quiet, focused competence that was his particular gift under pressure, but she could see in the evenings that the cumulative weight of it was wearing on him, not breaking him but pressing on him in ways that showed in the set of his jaw and the pace at which he moved, and the slightly longer silences when they sat together. She did not try to fix it, because she understood it was not fixable except by time and weather and the work itself. What she did was make sure that the evenings were genuinely restful, that the food was good, that Daniel's bedtime routine was handled so that Isaiah could take that hour after supper to simply sit without immediate demand. She did these things without comment, without the performance of sacrifice, simply as a person who paid attention to what was needed and could provide it. One evening in November, when the worst of the crisis was past and the weather had briefly relented, he sat back in his chair and looked at her across the fire and said, "I don't know what I would have done without you this month." "You would have managed," she said, because it was true. "I know," he said, "but I wouldn't have managed as well. And I wouldn't have wanted to come inside at the end of the day the way I did." He paused. "You make this place worth coming into." She looked at him steadily. She thought about the woman on the train platform who had expected nothing and had protected herself by expecting nothing. And she thought about 3 years of being chosen, every day, not by ceremony, but by the small continuous choices of a person who valued her specifically, her thoughts and her work and her company and her. "You do the same for me," she said. Their second child came in 1887, a daughter they named Rosa, after Elena Vasquez had said once that she had always liked the name, and it had stuck in Olive's memory. Rosa was nothing like Daniel in temperament. Where Daniel was deliberate and observant, Rosa was immediate and emphatic, making her preferences known from the first days of her life with a clarity that both amused and slightly terrified her parents. She had Olive's gray eyes and Isaiah's dark hair, and a quality of absolute uncompromising certainty about what she wanted that she appeared to have arrived with fully formed. Daniel adored her. This was immediately apparent and remained consistently true. He was 3 years old when she was born, and he treated her from the first with a protective, deeply invested attention that made Olive think about brothers and sisters, and the particular bonds that formed in the context of the wide open life they were living, far from other children, making a world with the materials at hand. By 1888, the ranch was profitable in the full sense, not just sustaining itself, but generating the kind of returns that allowed for genuine choices about the future. Isaiah had kept his head when other ranchers in the region had borrowed heavily against land and cattle prices that turned volatile in the mid-'80s, and this conservatism, which had sometimes felt like constraint, now appeared as wisdom. The operation was sound in a way that many around them were not, and this soundness gave them something that Olive valued intensely, which was the ability to make decisions from choice rather than necessity. She and Isaiah talked about the future a great deal during this period, about what the ranch could become, about Daniel's education and Rose's, about the territory itself, which was in the process of the long, complicated transformation from open range and trail drives to something more settled and bounded. The great cattle drives were already declining as the railroads pushed further into Texas, and the economics of the long drives shifted. Caldwell itself was changing, the particular wildness of the trailtown years giving way to a more domestic shape as families arrived and put down roots and built churches and schools. Clara Finch, who was now Clara Archer and the mother of a small boy named William, was one of the people helping to build the school. She and Olive sat on the committee together and argued productively about curriculum and building materials and the qualifications to seek in a teacher, and their friendship had deepened from the careful mutual respect of the early years into something with roots, something that had survived difficulty and change and was richer for both. In the spring of 1889, Olive decided she wanted to take on students. The idea came from a conversation with Sylvia Crane about the number of women in the area, ranch wives and women in town, who were working with limited literacy and numeracy, and who were disadvantaged by it in ways that were practical and immediate, struggling with correspondence and accounts, and the basic written requirements of a life in commerce. Olive had always been a good reader and a clear writer, and she had the patience for teaching, she believed, which was different from the patience for simply doing things. She spoke to Isaiah about it and he asked questions, and then said it was a good idea and asked what she needed. And she said time 2 afternoons a week and a clean table and good light, and he said she had all of those things. She started with 3 women, a young wife from a neighboring ranch who had limited schooling, the daughter of one of Caldwell's merchants who was anxious about the business correspondence she was beginning to take on, and a woman of about 40 named Frances who had arrived in the territory as a child and had never received formal education and wanted to learn because she had decided at 40 that she was not finished yet. Frances was Olive's favorite student, though she would not have admitted it, because Frances approached every lesson with a fierce, joyful determination that was one of the more inspiring things Olive had witnessed. By autumn she had 6 students. By the following year she had 10, and the 2 afternoons had expanded to 3, and she had had to move the sessions from her kitchen table to the schoolroom in town on days when Daniel and Rose's classes were not in session. Isaiah attended Daniel's school performance in December of 1889, a presentation of readings and recitations that the schoolchildren had prepared for their parents, and he sat in the third row with Rosa on his knee and watched his 9-year-old son stand at the front of the room and read from a text with the steady, clear voice that was unmistakably a Reed quality. And Olive was beside him, and she saw him swallow hard before he schooled his expression. And she reached over and put her hand over his, and he turned his hand over and held hers, and they sat that way through the rest of the performance. On the drive home, Daniel told them with great analytical precision everything that could have been done better by the other students and also by himself. And Isaiah and Olive exchanged a glance over his head that contained approximately 17 things, including profound amusement and unmistakable love. And Rosa had fallen asleep against Isaiah's shoulder and was drooling slightly on his coat, and neither of them said a word about it for the entire ride home. The years were accumulating now in the way that good years do, building on each other, each one adding something to the foundation rather than taking from it. The ranch reached 500 head by 1890, and Isaiah began to think seriously about what it would look like in 20 years, the kind of thinking that was only possible for a man with something solid beneath him. He and Rodrigo were getting older in each other's company, the easy friendship of men who had weathered a great deal together and had arrived at the place where words were sometimes unnecessary. Alina and Olive had become something closer than friends and not quite family, which was its own category and maybe the best one, the people you had chosen specifically for who they were, and who had chosen you the same way. In the summer of 1891, Isaiah took the whole family to Wichita for a week, Olive to visit her sister, who had in the intervening years undergone something of a softening, and had written twice with what appeared to be genuine regret for the earlier years, and the children because they had never been to a city, and Isaiah thought it would do them good to see something beyond the ranch in Caldwell. Olive's sister Ruth was different from the woman in Olive's memory, or perhaps Olive herself was different enough that the dynamic between them could be different, or perhaps both things were true. Ruth was warmer. Her husband was less present. Ruth's children were older now, school-aged, and they and Daniel and Rosa sorted themselves out within an afternoon with the efficient social negotiation of children who are accustomed to not knowing everyone they meet. On the second evening, Olive and Ruth sat on Ruth's porch in the warm Wichita evening, and Ruth said, "You look happy, Olive, you really do." Olive considered this. "I am," she said. "I really am." "I'm glad," Ruth said. "I know the early time wasn't easy here. I know Peter and I didn't." She stopped. "I know it wasn't what you needed. It got me to the train platform in Caldwell," Olive said. "I don't regret how it ended up." Ruth looked at her for a moment and then out into the quiet street and then back at Olive with something in her face that was close to tears. "He looks at you the way I always hoped someone would look at you," she said. Olive thought of Isaiah across the main room, sitting on the floor with all 4 children building something out of wooden blocks, his large frame folded improbably down to their level, his face wearing that unguarded openness she had first seen at the ranch when he asked her to marry him. "Yes," she said, "he does." They were back at the ranch in time for the late summer work, and the week in Wichita had the effect of making her understand her own life more clearly by contrast. The ranch and the prairie and the sky and the specific quality of the life she had built there were not, she now understood with absolute certainty, things she had settled for. They were things she had arrived at. There was a difference between the two that mattered enormously. In the autumn of 1892, Olive became aware that she was expecting their 3rd child. Daniel was 8 and Rosa was 5, and the house had expanded again the previous year. A proper room added for each child on the north side with a covered walkway connecting it to the main house. And so the practical considerations were manageable. What was not immediately manageable was the quality of her tiredness in the early months, which was deeper and more persistent than it had been with either of the previous pregnancies. and which worried Isaiah in a way she could see in the care with which he arranged the work of the house, so that none of it fell to her unnecessarily. She told him she was fine, and he said he knew she was fine, but that fine and resting were not mutually exclusive, and she conceded this point because it was accurate. Alina came more frequently through the late autumn and winter, ostensibly to help with Rosa, who was at an age of spectacular emotional volatility, but actually to provide the female company and the specific kind of conversation that was different from anything she could have with Isaiah. Not better, but different and necessary. They sat at the kitchen table on cold afternoons and talked about everything and nothing, and Alina told her about a letter she had received from her family in Texas that contained a complicated mixture of news and guilt and longing, and Olive told her about the women she was teaching and the particular satisfaction of watching Frances, who was now 42 and reading with genuine fluency, write her own name in full with a quality of concentration and then satisfaction that was one of the best things Olive had been present for. Their third child was born in April of 1893, a boy, and they named him Samuel. He was born in the early morning when the light on the plains had that particular quality of new possibility that April mornings had, and he was healthy and demanding from the first, and had an expression of profound skepticism that made everyone who looked at him laugh. Daniel, who was 9 by this time, received the news of his brother with the analytical detachment that was his characteristic mode, and then came and stood beside Olive's bed and looked at Samuel for a long time and then said, "He looks uncertain." "He just arrived," Olive said. "Give him time." Daniel considered this with serious fairness. "All right," he said. Rosa loved Samuel with the immediate, absolute, somewhat overwhelming affection of a 5-year-old for whom everything was still total. She appointed herself his primary guardian, which created a certain amount of logistical complexity as Samuel grew, and Rosa's guardianship began to take the form of attempting to follow him everywhere and narrate everything he was doing. But the love beneath the chaos was genuine, and eventually became the foundation of a bond between them that would last their whole lives. Isaiah, the second morning after Samuel's birth, came and sat beside Olive on the bed in the early morning light when the house was still quiet, and looked at the sleeping baby between them and then at her. And his face was doing the thing it had done when Daniel was born, that full, undefended wonder. But there was also something else now. Something that was the accumulation of 11 years of shared life. A depth of feeling that had been present from the beginning and had only grown more specific and more rooted with every year. 3, he said. 3, she agreed. This house is going to be very full, he said. It already is, she said, meaning the rooms and the children and the noise and the life that filled every corner of the place they had made together. He looked at her for a long moment. "Thank you," he said. She understood he did not mean for Samuel specifically, or not only for Samuel. He meant the whole of it, the 11 years and the work and the life they had built side by side from a foundation of nothing more than two people deciding, slowly and then completely, to trust each other. "Thank you," she said back, with the same meaning. And they let that stand as the whole of what needed to be said, because neither of them had ever needed more words than the moment required. The spring of 1893 moved toward summer with Samuel growing fast, and Rosa beginning her schooling at the Caldwell schoolhouse, and Daniel developing a focused interest in the cattle operation that Isaiah found both practically useful and quietly moving. The sight of his son absorbing the knowledge that he himself had worked to accumulate over a lifetime. Daniel rode out with Isaiah and Rodrigo when weather and school permitted, and asked the same kind of precise, specific questions that he had always asked. And Rodrigo said once that the boy had his father's eye for cattle and his mother's eye for everything else, which Isaiah repeated to Olive that evening at supper. And she said she was not sure whether it was a compliment, and he said he was certain it was. The teaching continued and expanded. By 1893, Olive had 15 regular students, and had begun to think about whether the work she was doing had a shape beyond the informal, whether there was a way to establish it as something with more permanence and structure. She spoke to the school board about this. Clara's husband David Archer was now on the board, which helped, and by the end of the year there was a formal adult literacy program connected to the school, with Olive as its unpaid director. The unpaid part was a matter she intended to address, and did address, by the end of 1894, having argued the case with the quiet, specific persistence that was one of her most effective qualities. Isaiah came to her first class of the year when she began the formal program, sat in the back row of the schoolroom in his good coat, and looked at her standing at the front of the room with her students arranged before her. And she caught his expression once during the lesson when she was explaining something about vowel sounds, and he was watching her with such an uncomplicated mixture of admiration and affection that she nearly lost her place in the lesson and had to pause and look at her notes to recover. She told him afterward that he had been distracting. He said he was not sorry. She said she had not expected him to be. He took her hand on the walk to the wagon and did not let go of it. The years continued. Samuel grew and then grew more, with a wild, joyful energy that was unlike either of his siblings, and that kept the ranch in a constant state of productive chaos. Daniel at 13 was already doing real work on the cattle operation, not as a helper but as a person with genuine responsibility, and watching Isaiah teach him was one of the things Olive stored most carefully in the archive of her memory. The two of them moving through the work together, the steady, unhurried way Isaiah explained things, the way Daniel's growing competence met his father's trust and expanded to fill it. Rosa was 7, and then 8, and then 10, and had her own opinions about everything, stated with a clarity that made conversation with her extremely bracing and never boring. She had decided at 8 that she was going to be a teacher like her mother, and at 10 that she was going to be a lawyer, and at 12 that she was going to do both. And Olive said both seemed achievable to her, and Isaiah said he had no doubt whatsoever. And Rosa received this endorsement as no more than she expected, which was precisely the right way to receive it. In 1896, Isaiah's ranch reached 650 head, which was the number at which the operation was not just profitable but genuinely secure, the kind of secure that was insulated against a bad year or even two. He told Olive the numbers over supper one evening in July, laying the ledger open on the table between them after the children were in bed, and she went through it with him the way she had learned to go through the books over the years, understanding now what the figures meant in context and what they implied for the years ahead. "We built something," he said. "We did," she said. He looked at her over the open ledger in the lamplight, and she held his gaze, and for a moment they were both 20-something again, in this same house when it was smaller and newer, in that first autumn when the extension was just a foundation outline in the grass, and the future was a thing being proposed rather than something already lived. "Olive," he said. "Yes," she said. "Do you know what I think about when I ride out in the mornings and the light is right and the land is good?" She shook her head. "I think about the fact that you're here," he said, "still, that you chose this, that you didn't have to and you did." She thought about a woman on a train platform in a faded calico dress holding a carpet bag, positioning herself to be passed over, building her whole bearing around the expectation of invisibility. "Isaiah," she said, "yes. I've been thinking something for a long time that I don't know if I've said properly." He waited. He was good at waiting. "I spent most of my life believing that being chosen first was not a thing that was going to happen to me," she said. "I had very good reasons for believing that. And then you rode into Caldwell on a Tuesday in July, and you carried a letter 12 miles, and you walked to the end of a platform past 5 other women, and you asked my name." She paused. "You didn't know anything about me yet. You just stopped, and I have thought about that almost every day since." He was very still across the table from her. "I want you to know," she said, That whatever you saw when you stopped, I have spent 14 years trying to be that, and I believe I am closer to it now than I was then, and I think it is in part because you have always seen it, and so I have had to also. Does that make sense?" "It makes perfect sense," he said quietly. "I love you," she said. "I love you in a way that I don't think I could have loved you in that first year because I didn't know then how much there was to love. I know now. It took 14 years and 3 children and more cold winters and good summers than I can count, and I know." He stood up and came around the table, and she stood to meet him, and he held her the way he had always held her, with the particular care of someone who knows the value of what he is holding, and she pressed her face against his chest and heard his heart beating under her ear, and he said into her hair, "Every day. You know I've been yours every day since July of 1882. That doesn't change, it grows." They stood there in the lamplight of the kitchen they had built together while their children slept in the rooms beyond, and the prairie was dark and enormous around the house, and the lamp cast its warm circle against the dark, and she thought that this was what a life was, not a single moment of being chosen, but the choosing and the choosing and the choosing again, every day. In all the small and large ways a life was made of. Samuel started school in 1898 and declared within the first week that he did not understand why everyone else was so slow, a statement that caused his teacher to write a note home and caused Isaiah and Olive to have a conversation with their youngest about the difference between being quick and being kind that Samuel received with the polite skepticism that was his signature mode. But he was a good-natured child under the briskness, and he did eventually figure out that the speed of other people's understanding was not a personal commentary on himself, and by the time he was 12, he was the child in any situation most likely to stay to help with whatever needed doing after everyone else had moved on. Daniel was 16 in 1900 and beginning to think about the future with the focused attention he brought to everything. He wanted to take the ranch further. He had ideas about land acquisition to the south, about the changing market for beef as the territory developed, about the breed improvements that some of the more progressive operations were making. He brought these ideas to his father with the now familiar combination of analytical clarity and evident passion, and Isaiah heard each one with the full attention it deserved and responded with the specific engagement of a man who was not humoring his son, but genuinely thinking alongside him. Olive sat at the kitchen table on a winter evening in 1900 and watched Isaiah and Daniel work through a set of figures together, their dark heads bent over the same ledger, the same quality of focused presence in both of them, and Rosa beside her doing her own reading and Samuel already asleep, and the fire going well against the winter cold outside, and she felt the entirety of it settle over her like something warm and made for her specific shape. She was 42 years old. She had arrived in Caldwell in a faded dress with a carpetbag and no expectations. She had a house full of children and the particular kind of marriage that was built from genuine seeing and genuine choosing, and she ran a teaching program that had in 12 years taught 43 people to read and write and understand numbers, and she was not finished. She had a study with a good south window and books on shelves that her husband had built for her. She had a kitchen garden that produced abundantly every summer. She had Elena and Rodrigo and Clara and her sister Ruth in letters, and the particular quality of home that she had spent the first 2 decades of her life not knowing whether she would ever reach. Isaiah looked up from the ledger and across the table at her, the way he had of looking up at exactly the moment she was looking at him, and she thought that this too was a thing that had not diminished with years but grown more precise. The particular frequency on which they were tuned to each other, the way a glance still carried the full weight of everything shared. He raised an eyebrow slightly, the question in it. She shook her head just slightly, the answer being, "Nothing is wrong, everything is right, I was just looking at you." He held her gaze for a moment, and the corner of his mouth lifted, and then he was back to the ledger with Daniel, and she was back to her mending, and the fire went on burning, and the winter went on outside, and the house held all of it the way it had been built too. By the summer of 1901, there was a conversation to be had about Daniel going to college, which was not the most natural aspiration for the son of a Kansas cattleman in 1901, but was entirely consistent with Daniel, who had been conducting himself as though education were simply the next logical step since approximately the age of 4. He had been corresponding with a college in Lawrence and had been accepted for the autumn term, and he came to his parents with the acceptance letter and presented it with the directness that was the clearest evidence of whose son he was. Isaiah looked at the letter for a long time. Then he looked at Daniel. Then he looked at Olive. "Go," Isaiah said. Daniel said he had been concerned that the timing was wrong, with the expansion plans still in progress. Isaiah said the expansion plans would wait, and the timing would never be perfect, and that his son was going to college. Olive said nothing during this exchange because everything that needed to be said was being said, and she was occupied with the particular sharp sweetness of watching two people she loved honor each other. Later, when Daniel was outside and Isaiah came to find her in the study where she had retreated to feel what she felt in privacy, he leaned in the doorway and said, "He'll come back. He's a reed, he comes back to the land." "I know," she said. "You all right?" "I'm proud," she said. "I'm so proud of him I can barely stand it. That's what's happening." He came in and sat on the edge of the desk, and she leaned her head against his arm for a moment, which was a thing she had done for 19 years and which still felt exactly right, and they were quiet together for a little while. Daniel left for Lawrence in September of 1901 on the train from Caldwell, and all 5 of them stood on the platform. On the same platform where, 19 years before, a man on a dark bay horse had stopped at the end of it and asked a woman's name, and Olive thought about that as she watched her son embrace his father and then turn to her. Daniel was tall like Isaiah, with his mother's gray eyes, and he hugged her with the full conviction of a young man who had never learned to be indirect about anything, and she held on for the right length of time, and then let him go because that was the other thing parenthood required, and she watched him board the train and found the window where he appeared and waved once with his measured, unsentimental wave. The train left. Isaiah put his arm around her. Rosa stood on her other side and slipped her hand into Olive's, and Samuel was kicking at a loose board in the platform with the restless energy of a 13-year-old, whose brother had just left for an adventure he could not follow yet. "Well," said Rosa with an 11-year-old's absolute authority, "he'll come back different." "People often do," Olive said. "Will it be better different or worse different?" Olive thought about arriving in Caldwell in 1882 with a carpetbag and a faded dress and no expectations, and about everything that had changed since, and whether changed was the same as better and whether better was the right word. "Both," she said. "Usually both, and then you decide what to do with the difference." She felt Isaiah look at her over the top of Rosa's head, and she turned and met his eyes, and there, in the late summer light on the Caldwell train platform where they had begun, they held each other's gaze for a long moment that contained 19 years and 3 children and 600 cattle and a kitchen garden, and a study with good south windows and 43 people who could read because of her, and all the cold winters and the good summers and the letters and the Sunday suppers, and the first time he had said her name and stopped looking anywhere else. She had never once been chosen first. Not before July of 1882 on a Kansas train platform, not in the years before when she had stood in rooms and felt the world's attention distribute itself toward anyone but her. She had built herself a careful, dignified life out of not being chosen, had made herself sufficient out of being overlooked, had become skilled at invisibility. And then a man had ridden down a platform and chosen her first and most specifically, and had gone on choosing her, every day, with the same quiet, unflappable certainty with which he did everything else. And she had done the same for him, and they had built something out of it that neither of them could have built alone. She turned back to the empty track where the train had gone, and then looked out across the main street of Caldwell, which was older and more settled now than it had been in the trail town years, its wildness domesticated somewhat but not entirely, still carrying the quality of a place that was alive to possibility. The prairie beyond it was what it had always been, vast and gold, and indifferent in the beautiful way of things that outlast every human concern. Isaiah took her hand at her side and she held it, and the afternoon light was long across the platform and the town and the open country beyond it, and Olive Vaughn Reed, who was 42 years old and entirely at home in her life, stood in the sun and felt the specific, complete, daily renewed contentment of a woman who had been found by the right person and had had the sense to stand still and let it be true. Samuel ran up the platform chasing something, a paper twist of candy Rosa had thrown at him, and Rosa called after him that it was wasted now, and he yelled back that it was not, and they came past their parents in a small tornado of argument, and Isaiah said their names once in the voice that meant not today, and they subsided into muttering, and Olive laughed. And the laugh was the same one she had on that first evening at supper at the restaurant on Chestnut Street, when he had made a dry observation, and she had felt the laugh come out of her before she had decided to let it, and she caught him watching her now with the same expression he had worn then, which was the expression of a man who found a woman particularly, completely delightful. "Take me home," she said. "Always," he said, and meant it in every possible direction. They went down the platform steps together and across the street to where the wagon waited, and Rosa fell into step on Olive's other side, still complaining about Samuel, and Samuel climbed into the wagon bed and said something that made his sister laugh despite herself, and Isaiah helped Olive up to the seat and then settled beside her and took up the reins, and the horses turned south through Caldwell's main street and out past the edge of town where the prairie began. 12 miles southeast, the house waited, full of their life, the books in the study, the kitchen garden beginning its autumn slowdown, the horses in the corral, the cattle in the south pasture, Rodrigo and Alina in the neighboring house, the fire that would need building against the evening cool, the chairs on the porch, the lamp in the window. Daniel's room empty now, but not in any way that was permanent. A life full enough that even its absences were temporary. Olive sat beside her husband on the wagon seat as the grass opened around them, and the sky went wide overhead with all its particular prairie extravagance, and she watched the horizon where her home would appear eventually over the low rise, and she felt the sun on her face and the wind and the particular deep-rootedness of a person who has arrived, and she was content. She was entirely, specifically, completely content, all the way home.